I was mopping the marble floor of the boardroom at exactly 8:17 a.m. when the CEO walked in and asked if I knew how to stay invisible. The room smelled faintly of lemon polish and expensive coffee, the kind that comes in silver carafes no one like me is meant to touch, and I kept my eyes down the way I had learned to over the past 11 months. You need to understand something. When a man reaches 62 years old and finds himself wearing a janitor's uniform after 4 decades in business, he learns very quickly which parts of himself the world still values, and which parts it has already discarded. I had been hired under the name, Frank D. Collins, a shortened version of my own, because it made things simpler for payroll, and because I wasn't interested in explaining anything to anyone who never bothered to ask. The CEO, his name was Bradley Pierce, didn't look at my face when he spoke. He gestured with 2 fingers, like I was a chair slightly out of place. "Make sure this room is spotless," he said, his voice clipped, impatient, already moving on to more important things. "We've got a $2.4 million acquisition meeting in 20 minutes. And I nodded, because that's what men like me do when the room decides we don't belong in it anymore. But there was a moment, just a small one, when he dropped a folder on the table, and I caught a glimpse of the company letterhead. It hadn't changed. Not the font. Not the insignia. Not even the slight misalignment in the lower right corner that I had argued about back in 1998. Have you ever stood in a place that used to carry your name, and realized no one left remembers you? Because I have, and I can tell you, it doesn't feel like anger. It feels like something quieter. Like grief that never quite learned how to speak. Nobody tells you that being a provider for 35 years can end with you being treated like background noise in your own legacy. I continued mopping, slow and steady, listening as their polished shoes echoing across the floor I had just cleaned, their voices layered with confidence that hadn't been earned in the same way mine had. And then Bradley said something, half a joke, half a dismissal, that made the entire room laugh softly. "Let's just hope the cleaning staff knows their place today." And I smiled. Not because it was funny. Not because it didn't sting. But because in that moment, holding that mop at 8:19 a.m., I realized something none of them had considered. Not one of them had looked closely enough at the contract sitting right in front of them. What I am about to tell you, I have never said out loud to anyone in that building, not even on my last day there. At 8:42 a.m., I was still in that same boardroom, now wiping fingerprints from the glass table as if I hadn't already memorized every name printed on the documents they were about to sign. Bradley sat at the head of the table, confident, relaxed, speaking in that rehearsed tone executives use when they believe the outcome is already theirs. And I stayed quiet. I always stayed quiet. You need to know what happens when a man stops correcting people. He begins to see exactly who they are without interruption. The first incident came quickly. One of the junior partners, a man no older than 34, slid his empty coffee cup toward me without looking and said, "Hey, can you grab another?" Black. No please. No eye contact. Just expectation. I took the cup, nodded once, and walked out, because dignity doesn't always announce itself, it sometimes just refuses to argue. On my way back, I passed the reception desk where I had once interviewed candidates for leadership roles, back in 2007, when this company still operated out of a single floor and a borrowed conference room. The receptionist didn't recognize me. Of course she didn't. Time has a way of erasing men who no longer introduce themselves. The second moment came sharper. Bradley was reviewing the contract terms and frowned. Tapping his pen against page 7. "Who structured this clause?" he asked, irritation creeping into his voice. "It's unnecessarily restrictive." I felt something shift inside me then, not pride, not anger, just a quiet acknowledgement. I had written that clause. Word for word. On a Tuesday in October, 2019, at exactly 6:15 p.m., after a 3-hour negotiation with a supplier who thought he could outmaneuver me. And I remember thinking back then that one day, this clause would protect the company from the very kind of deal Bradley was now trying to rush through. Have you ever built something so carefully that even years later, it still holds its shape without you? Because that's what real work does, it outlives recognition. Nobody clapped when I wrote it. Nobody stayed late with me. And yet there it was, quietly doing its job while I stood 10 feet away holding a rag. The third incident was the one that settled everything. Bradley looked directly at me this time, just briefly, and said, "Make sure you're out of here before we sign." Confidentiality. His tone wasn't cruel. It was worse than that. It was indifferent. Like I didn't exist beyond the function I served. And I nodded again, same as before. But this time, something inside me had already made its decision. Because there comes a point in a man's life, usually later than it should, when he realizes silence is no longer patience. It's permission. And as I placed the fresh coffee down at exactly 8:57 a.m., I decided, very calmly, that I would no longer be part of this room, at least, not in the way they expected. That decision I made in silence, it was already in motion long before any of them realized something had changed. At 9:03 a.m., I stepped out of the boardroom. Quiet. Measured. The door clicked shut behind me. I didn't rush. Men like me don't rush. The hallway smelled faintly of printer toner and that recycled air every office seems to breathe. Dry. Cold. Familiar. I walked past the same glass walls I had once approved in the building plans back in 2001. My shoes didn't echo the way theirs did. Soft soles. Intentional. You need to pay attention here, because this is where everything begins to shift. I reached the service elevator and pressed the button. Once. No impatience. No second press. It arrived in 11 seconds. I counted. Inside, the metal panel was cool under my fingers as I pressed 12. Executive floor. The one my badge technically didn't grant access to. But systems, like people, remember their original architects. And I had designed that override myself. The doors opened without resistance. No alarms. No questions. Just acceptance. I stepped out into a different world. Carpet thicker. Air quieter. Even the light felt softer. And for a moment, just one, I paused. Because standing there at 9:05 a.m., I remembered the day I signed the initial lease for this floor, $847,000 a year, and how my wife had asked me if it was too much. I told her then, not if we build something that lasts. She passed in 2021. And I hadn't stood on this floor since. Grief doesn't knock loudly. It just waits in places like that. Have you ever returned somewhere that still holds the echo of someone you loved? It doesn't break you. It just reminds you who you used to be. I walked down the corridor. Slow steps. Controlled breathing. Past offices with names I didn't recognize. Until I reached the one at the end. My name wasn't on the door anymore. Of course it wasn't. But inside that room sat the one thing they had overlooked. The original file. Locked. Untouched. I entered the code. 1-9-9-8, the year it all started. The drawer opened with a soft click. Paper. Thick. Official. Final. Short sentences now. I picked it up. Closed the drawer. Turned. No hesitation. No doubt. Nobody notices the man who moves quietly until the room depends on what he's carrying. And that's the truth most people learn too late. I walked back to the elevator. Down to the boardroom. 9:11 a.m. The meeting was still going. Voices louder now. Slight tension. Bradley pacing. He had sensed it. Not the truth. Just something. A delay he couldn't explain. A resistance he couldn't see. I opened the door. Slowly. Every head turned. I stepped inside. Still holding the folder. And without saying a word, I walked to the table, and placed it directly in front of him. What happened in that room next, none of them were prepared for, even though every piece of it had been sitting in front of them for years. Bradley looked down at the folder at exactly 9:12 a.m., his hand resting on it the way a man touches something he assumes already belongs to him, and then he saw the name printed across the signature line. Not the shortened version. Not Frank D. Collins. My full name. The one that carried weight long before he ever stepped into that company. He didn't open it right away. That's what I remember most. He just stared. Quiet. Still. And for the first time since he walked into that boardroom, he looked directly at me, not through me, not past me, at me. You need to understand something about moments like that, they don't explode. They settle. Slowly. Like dust in a room that's just been disturbed. This, he started, his voice lower now, uncertain in a way it hadn't been before, this can't be right. But it was. Page after page confirmed it. Ownership structure. Controlling interest. Deferred authority clauses that had never been revoked. The very clause he questioned, page 7, was the one that prevented him from executing that $2.4 million acquisition without my authorization. I didn't say a word while he read. I didn't need to. Because truth doesn't get stronger when you raise your voice, it gets stronger when you let it stand on its own. Have you ever watched someone realize they've been standing on ground they never owned? It doesn't make you feel powerful. Not the way people think. It feels heavy. Like watching a man lose something he didn't even know he had borrowed. One of the partners shifted in his seat. Another cleared his throat. The room had changed. Completely. And yet, I stayed exactly the same. Same posture. Same calm breath. Because dignity isn't something you turn on when you win, it's something you carry even when no one sees you losing. Bradley finally spoke again, softer now. Why didn't you say anything? And that question lingered longer than anything else in that room. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because he wasn't ready to hear it. Nobody tells you this, but the man who builds something rarely fights to prove he built it. He just knows. I adjusted my grip on the handle of the mop still resting beside me and said, quietly, because I wanted to see who you were when you thought I didn't matter. And there it was. Not triumph. Not revenge. Just truth. Clean. Unavoidable. The meeting didn't end dramatically. No shouting. No grand exit. Just silence, followed by understanding that came too late to be useful. I turned to leave at 9:19 a.m., not as a janitor, not as something reclaimed, but simply as a man who no longer needed to be recognized to know his worth. And before I closed the door, I said the only thing that felt worth saying after all those years. Respect isn't proven when you're seen, it's revealed in how you treat the ones you choose to ignore.